Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to be sharing with you part 3 of an examination of the history of the relationship between the Obama administration and Israel from the viewpoint of Dennis Ross. Dennis Ross was the U.S. point person for the Middle East peace process during the administrations of George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton. He was also a special advisor to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton during the Obama administration. The following are excerpts from an interview with Frontline. Ross was asked, "How do you view Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu?" He said, "He's someone who has grown up with a view that focuses primarily on the threats to Israel, that Israel faces a hostile world, and that its margin for error is exceedingly small, that the neighborhood in the Middle East has not accepted Israel. Maybe Egypt has done a peace treaty with Israel in 1979, but the Middle East in general hasn't accepted it. So Israel has to keep its guard up, and if you let your guard down just a little bit, you're exposed and you're put at risk." In a sense, Netanyahu views that the sharks are out to get Israel. He was asked, "Okay, it's 2008. Journalist Marvin Kalb tells us a great story of being in Israel at the King David Hotel and going into the coffee shop or cafe and seeing Benjamin Netanyahu sitting alone in the corner, reading newspapers. So he sits with him and he asks, 'How are you doing?' And Netanyahu says, 'I'm wondering a lot about this Barack Hussein Obama. Who is this guy with the name Hussein, and what are you thinking about it?' And Marvin said that he could tell almost from the beginning that there was not only among Netanyahu and his immediate friends, but also on the Israeli street, a kind of anxiety about Barack Obama." Ross answers, "I have a different perspective regarding Netanyahu in this matter. Netanyahu had a conversation with me even in 2007 where he told me, 'I think that Obama is going to get the presidential nomination rather than Hillary Clinton.' And he says to me, 'I think he's a really interesting guy.' And initially, Netanyahu is not suspicious of Obama at all, but on the contrary, he's asked, 'That's so interesting. What do you think?' Because some of the story too is that Obama and Netanyahu never got along even from the very beginning." Ross says, "Not true. From Netanyahu, not so. Their schism started after Netanyahu was elected Prime Minister of Israel in 2009. With Netanyahu's first meeting with Obama, Netanyahu feels like he's being blindsided by the political position that the Obama administration takes regarding Israeli settlements in the West Bank, but not prior to that. Literally, first Netanyahu had this conversation with me in 2007, where he says he thinks that Obama is going to win the U.S. presidency. And so I asked him at the time, 'Why do you think that?' Because nobody in the United States was predicting that Obama was going to win the presidency at that time. Netanyahu said, 'You know, Obama has the capacity to explain things and to create a sense of new possibilities.' He said, 'I might be wrong, but I think he's really the guy that's going to end up being president of the United States. He's at least somebody who needs to be watched." Ross was asked, "Tell me about Netanyahu in the first time that he came to meet the Obama administration." Ross said, "I was in the U.S. State Department. I see Obama regarding the situation with Iran. And every time we have an Iranian discussion, I'm a part of these talks. And it's interesting. Almost every time I see Obama, he asks me a question about Israel. The first time I talk to him about Netanyahu is I'm asked to come and brief him for his initial meeting with Netanyahu." And Ross is asked, "The very first one?" And he said, "The very first one." So Special Envoy for the Middle East peace process, George Mitchell, is there to brief Obama on the peace process. And I'm there to brief him on Iran. And that's the first time I had a serious discussion with him about Netanyahu. Prior to that, Obama asks me literally every time I see him, even though the subject is Iran-oriented, every time he'll ask me a question about Israel. Every time I end up seeing him. So Ross is asked, like, "What kind of questions?" And Ross says, "Well, For example, we got into a discussion about under what circumstances would Israel launch a military attack against the Iranian nuclear facilities. And I said, this is kind of following the earlier discussion, but Obama asked me, what do you think the odds are that Israel will strike Iran now? And I said to him, well, you know, Israel is sending people over there right now, and I'm having conversations with them already. And in my conversations, I'm showing them that we're pretty much serious about doing something. Ross has asked, doing something meaningful like negotiating with Iran? And he said yes, but not just negotiating, but building pressure on Iran so that they have to change their behavior regarding their nuclear program. But I advised Obama that in Israel there's not a great deal of patience about the matter. And then Obama asked me a question at one point, and he said, does Israel ever think strategically? That was an interesting question, and I said, well, look, like most leaders, they look at what are the near-term problems. And if you look, the Israeli military is always planning strategically. But frequently, Israeli leaders, I said, they're not unique in this respect, and that they are focusing on any near-term problems and what are any possible near-term threats against the country. Ross has asked, and George Mitchell is going over to talk about the peace process in a different way. Ross says, right, that's correct. Ross has asked, there's these two tracks that eventually, in that very first meeting with Netanyahu, are going to cause tension between Netanyahu and Obama. And Ross says, that's correct. Ross has asked, and one of these tracks, to be overseen by Special Envoy to the Middle East George Mitchell, is separate from yours, where you are focusing on the Iranian issue. And Ross says, right. So for the first meeting with Netanyahu, the briefing for Obama, George Mitchell was there to talk about the peace process. And I'm there to talk about Iran and how we should approach Iran and what Obama needs to do with Netanyahu to prove the seriousness of the United States regarding the Iranian nuclear program, so that, in fact, Netanyahu will give the United States time to do diplomacy with Iran over their nuclear program to see if the United States can find a diplomatic solution with Iran. So I'm going over with Obama what Netanyahu is going to ask him and what's the best way to deal with him so that the United States can buy time to conduct diplomatic negotiations with Iran regarding their nuclear program. So that's the main idea of what I'm saying to Obama. What George Mitchell is doing is different. Mitchell is emphasizing to Obama to get Netanyahu to agree to a freeze on settlement building in the West Bank. Ross has asked, when you hear George Mitchell mention this to Obama, what's your reaction? Do you bite your tongue? And Ross says, no, but this tells you a lot about Obama. I don't know if I made some type of facial reaction, maybe I did. But Obama says, as soon as Mitchell said that, Obama said, Dennis, what do you think? I haven't been involved in any of the peace-related discussions at this point, but I said, you're asking Netanyahu to do what none of the previous prime ministers of Israel have done? You're asking a conservative right-wing prime minister to do what none of the left-leading previous Israeli prime ministers have done? What explanation could he give to the Israeli public? And on what basis was he going to explain that he was going to do something that even former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who signed the 1993 Oslo Accords, which established the Palestinian Authority, couldn't do himself, and what former Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres, who's an advocate of a Palestinian state, couldn't do, and what former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who made an offer for a Palestinian state, didn't do. So Obama turns back to Mitchell and says, George, what's our answer to this? And Mitchell says, well, we're trying to reopen the liaison offices that Israel had with a number of Arab countries, including Morocco and Qatar and so forth. And we're also trying to get overflight rights for Israeli airline El Al over Saudi Arabia. So Obama turns to me and says, what do you think of that? And I said, you're still asking Netanyahu to do what no former Israeli prime minister was able to do. So Obama turns back to Mitchell and says, you know, I think on this issue you've got your work cut out for you. But to be fair to George Mitchell, Mitchell correctly said said, look, if you could satisfy Netanyahu regarding the Iranian nuclear issue, then you could politically ask him to do things regarding the peace process and settlement building in the West Bank. So Obama turned to me and said, all right, what would it mean to satisfy Netanyahu on the Iranian nuclear issue? And I said to him, to really satisfy him on the Iranian nuclear issue, what you have to say to Netanyahu is, look, the United States is going to take care of the situation with Iran, but we're going to do it diplomatically. And if it doesn't work diplomatically, I'll give you assurance that the United States will act militarily to take care of the problem. And so I told Obama, that is what it would take to satisfy him. And then you could take that and you could use it to say, if the United States does something like that, I need for Israel to create a climate in the region that makes it more acceptable, that we don't have a terrible fallout among the Muslim countries if the United States ends up having to use force against Iran. And establishing a Palestinian state is one way to transform the animosity that is held between Arabs and Jews. So for these reasons, Israel needs to take unprecedented steps regarding the peace process with the Palestinians. However, the reality of this was that this was too long of a bridge, too much to link together all at once. Ross was asked, for Obama? Ross said, Obama wasn't about to commit using U.S. military force against Iran if diplomacy with them regarding their nuclear program failed. Ross was asked, in the very first meeting, first, second, third of Obama's presidency? Ross said, correct. It is now 3 months into the Obama presidency. But that was the character of the very first meeting. The interviewer says, wow. And Ross replies, but that's the first conversation I have with Obama regarding how to deal with Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. Ross was asked, so you guys go out and get in the car, you and George Mitchell and the others. What did you think was going to happen when Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu walked into the office of the Obama administration? And Ross answered, we didn't go back to the U.S. State Department together. I actually was going back with then Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs, Bill Burns, I think, who may have been there at the same time. But I just said to him, you know, I'm not real hopeful this is going to be a great meeting. If the emphasis is put on freezing building in the West Bank, you're asking me, as I said, I don't see how Netanyahu is going to accept this. So I would put the emphasis in some other place. But that night when Netanyahu comes, he has a meeting with Obama. Then he comes over and has a dinner meeting at the State Department with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, of which I attended this meeting because we discussed all these issues. So Clinton takes Netanyahu aside at a particular point in the meeting and explains to him why a freeze in building Jewish homes in the West Bank is so important to Obama. And Netanyahu pretty much replies, look, I can't do a freeze in Jewish building in the West Bank. So I think from that first meeting that Netanyahu feels like he's going to be put into a corner. But yet he reacts to it. And he gives his 2009 Bar Ilan speech in Israel where he endorses a non-militarized Palestinian state. So I had been talking to some of the Israeli people regarding the peace process, and I told them before Netanyahu had his first meeting with Obama, I said, I'm not formally a part of the peace process team. My job is to deal with the Iranian nuclear issue. But it seems to me that you need to find a way in Netanyahu's first meeting with Obama to tell Obama that you're accepting, because you've never done it, that you're accepting a two-state solution. And maybe if you do that, it might go a long way towards satisfying Obama regarding the issue. And I still think it might have tempered what Obama was then pushing for with Netanyahu and what he said after the meeting with him if Netanyahu had gave Obama a plan about how Israel was going to tackle the situation. But Netanyahu didn't present any plan. And that, I believe, is sort of Netanyahu's style. Netanyahu has a tendency to not want to look like he's making preemptive concessions. Well, that's going to conclude this week's report, where we shared with you part 3 of examining the history of the relationship between the Obama administration and Israel from the viewpoint of Special Advisor to the Middle East Peace Process, Dennis Ross. Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.